This is Photographing the West podcast, the podcast for people who love to explore the western highways and byways while photographing the landscape and wildlife. And now here's your host, Kirby Flanagan.
Hello, and welcome to episode number 68 of the Photographing the West podcast, where we bring you interesting interviews with interesting people twice each month. Today, it's a pleasure to welcome back award-winning landscape photographer Gary Crabbe, and we're going to discuss his recent trip to China. Welcome, Gary.
Thank you. What a pleasure to be talking with you again, Kirby. Delight to be here.
And it's a delight to have you. So I guess my first question is, why China, and how long were you there?
I'll take the second part of that because that's the easiest one to answer. I was there for about 5.5 weeks, just shy of 6 weeks, from like July 2nd to about August 10th or something like that. So that was just this last summer. Why China? Oh my gosh. It is such a hard story, but the easiest way to say it was it started with a friend who lived in China asking me for a favor. Gentleman that I went through my college master's degree program had been over there for the last 7 years teaching English, and he was having some trouble with getting a visa renewed, so I offered to help him out by scurrying some documents to the Chinese embassy here in San Francisco for him. And he eventually wound up basically getting what we called trumped, because he wound up losing his work visa in China and then wound up basically getting kicked out of China and living with us. But he was also working remotely and had planned with my 17-year-old daughter to have her go to China and help with teaching a drama class and teaching little Chinese kids yoga. And so since she was only 17, I got volunteered to be the chaperone. And I was basically going to be spending 3.5 weeks while she was teaching the class, living in my buddy's apartment and taking some little day trips. And as things progressed, eventually just 10 days before we were set to go, the whole arrangement that they had completely fell apart. His apartment in China was given away along with all of his possessions. And so he's been stuck here in the U.S., and my daughter was unsure of what to do, but the class got canceled. And my daughter decided she didn't want to go over to China. And so I was basically left holding my chaperone's airline ticket, and it was like, well, I could either cancel it and stay home, or I could just go on my own, and I chose the latter. And so I went to China with basically an airline ticket and 4 nights reservation in a Shanghai hotel, and that was my total planned itinerary by the time I landed in China. So I basically had, 5 solid weeks of wide open, unplanned travel itinerary, and basically started to plan my trip hopfrogging, I had a basic idea of what I wanted to go see and how much time each particular place would require. And so that began just what I call the hopscotch across basically, a quarter of China. So that's how it worked. But yeah, why I wound up there is just a fluke, because it absolutely was not on my bucket list. It was not something, if someone had basically just walked up to me off the street and said, do you want to go to China? I probably would have said, no, thank you. I'm okay. But like I said, this was an occasion where suddenly I was left with an airline ticket and a huge chunk of open time in my calendar. So I just decided to hop on board the airplane and absolutely, as they say, wing it. So that's how it worked out.
Sounds like my trip. I had no intention of going to China either, but my oldest daughter was working for a company that had a division in China, and she needed to go over there and visit them and really didn't want to go by herself. So I went along for a week, and it was a good experience, learned a lot, and China was a lot different than I expected, I guess, in many ways. So definitely was educational.
Yeah, actually that is something that I would have to completely agree with, that it was eye-openingly different than what I expected. And I'm not sure what I expected, but especially in some of the big cities, the westernization was absolutely, eye-opening and stunning.
Yes.
And I would have perfectly have loved to have been over there with my daughter. If it had gone as planned, it would have been great, because we would have had about 10 days after her class ended to travel around China. But she's 17, and I can guarantee, I think she made the right call. We would never have survived probably 6 weeks traveling together. It would have been a fiasco, because I think we operate on two completely different levels in terms of what a 17-year-old girl wants to see or do versus what I would want to do in terms of photography. So it all worked out remarkably well. So I was happy to say.
Good. So talk about the logistics of going to China and getting around in China. I know we had to go through a company to get our visa for China, because there was no way I was going to make a trip to San Francisco and on the chance that I could get it all done in a day or two. So.
Right. And so that is actually one of the other interesting side aspects to this. Apparently, anyone that wants to go through China actually has to deal with going into the Chinese embassy, either in person or through an agency. And so when my buddy first posted his note requesting some assistance to run some documents over to the Chinese embassy, I had actually been there and helped him out and been to the Chinese embassy in San Francisco when he originally left 7 years ago. So I was familiar with it, which is kind of one of the reasons I raised my hand to say, sure, I'll take a document in there. And this whole thing became such a fiasco that between not just when I helped him out 7 years ago, but just starting this spring when he had his problem crop up, and then for dealing with my daughter and myself, I don't think there's any place in San Francisco that I've been to more now than the Chinese embassy. It's ridiculous. I think I've been there probably more than a dozen times. So
Oh, wow.
it's almost to the point of getting to know the security guard on a first name basis. So that was the first logistics. Dealing with my friend's visa was an absolutely insane thing. He says, China operates on 2,000 years of bureaucracy. And it is in full force when you're dealing with the embassy, and especially with something like a work visa. Fortunately, when I was doing this, it was a tourist visa, and it was much easier. It was basically the logistics of that just required the application and dropping it off in the embassy, and then going back 3 days later, and hopefully everything was approved, and you pick up your stamped passport and you're ready to hop on an airplane. So in that regard, it wasn't too bad, but you're absolutely right. For anyone out of the area, the fact that they make you go through an actual embassy could be a logistical nightmare, and that it does take several days. So like you, most people not near LA or San Francisco probably would choose to do it through an agency. And I think this accounts for, my buddy said, everyone from Seattle to Salt Lake City and Las Vegas and Phoenix, Arizona would all have to go through either San Francisco or the Los Angeles embassy. So, that part alone was relatively easy. I don't recommend trying to get a work visa because, the difference between the two was night and day. Tourist visa, no problem, relatively easy, just a pain in the backside to deal with the embassy. The other logistics was about getting around once I was in China. And so I did a bunch of research leading up to that in the weeks before I left. They have, one of the things my buddy had recommended is an equivalent of like Uber over there that they call Didi. And that would have been great for getting around the city. However, it required having a Chinese bank account to use. So I wasn't able to take advantage of any of the Uber services. In addition, the language barrier would have been a big issue for getting around that kind of way. I did find that there were a number of apps that I used to plan train trips between the major cities. One of them was called C-Trip, which is basically all internally in China. I did things like booking.com for hotels as well as the C-Trip. I was able to book train tickets. They had an app specifically for the Chinese high-speed trains that you could, they required generally purchasing tickets, 2 or 3 days in advance, especially if you want to get like a first-class seat on the train, which I found to be great. The high-speed trains were perfect, great, easy to use, very clean. I think I found one video on YouTube that basically taught me how to use the subway tickets, to purchase and get on and use the subways. And that basically worked out perfectly because the only other language on the subway machine other than Chinese was a tab to show everything in English. So that worked perfectly, and the subways over there were also, very, very clean and perfectly efficient. China, in that regard, seems to be pretty expert at the concept of moving people, which I found good. And then I had another app that actually did all of the local city bus routes. So I was able to hop on just basically city bus rides and get from place to place fairly easily without having to really know the language. You just look for the bus number and keep track of the stops. And that was great. I mean, I was able to take a nearly 20-mile bus ride and it cost me 95 cents. So, yeah, the logistics and using some of the apps were really great. So I was able to reserve all of my hotels, trains, stuff like that using the apps. And that was great. So I could book a hotel. I could pay for it with a credit card and just show up. And all you have to do is, hand them your phone and your passport to show them your reservation, and you were all good to go. And that actually brings up one of the other, eye-opening differences is that they do everything on their phone over there in terms of purchasing. Not only is it like hailing the Ubers like they do here, but they are completely adept and set up for using their phones for paying for groceries, for paying for food out in restaurants. In local shops, they just hold up their phone and bam, they're paying for it. And, you'll even see 87-year-old women sitting there and they've all got their smartphones. Every one of them is like completely geared into the technology of using their phones for, communications, just like we do here. But their purchasing aspect that they use the phone for far exceeds whatever I see here in the States. So that was eye-opening as well.
Did you spend any time in the countryside? My experience was that Beijing, where I was based and did day trips, was very modern and clean and very Western. But once you got outside of Beijing, it was an entirely different world.
Yeah, I went to a few places that would be considered in the countryside, and you're right. It is very, very similar in terms of the differences here between what would be a modern urban center versus, suburban kind of transport range, townships, and then the smaller rural communities. And I did visit a few. Definitely much less modern. The only modern hint that you would get in some of these towns, especially seeing them traveling by high-speed train, you'd be out in the middle of nowhere and you'd see just these little conglomerations of, small, rural, independent Chinese houses. And, they all kind of looked very much the same. But the one modern aspect is that everywhere you went, you saw cell phone towers. They were everywhere. And I think that at some point you could tell that they were completely immersed in the 5G range, because you would see cell towers, and my wife works for the phone company, so I get a sense of what's coming. With 5G, the range isn't very far, and you'd be driving through the trains, and you would see cell phone towers every half to 3/4 of a mile apart, scattered across the landscape. And you could look across and you'd see like 40 cell towers, and you're way out in the middle of nowhere, and that's all you see are houses and cell phone towers. And so that was pretty eye-opening as well. So yeah, even in the little tiny countrysides, they're building their communication network way out. But yeah, you'll find people that are much more kind of dressed traditionally versus Western. The cars, the vehicles are much older. In the big city center, you would see Lexus, BMWs, Audis, Porsches, all that. And then you get out to the countryside and it's kind of more like what you would expect to find in Cuba. You find, like old, three-wheeled tractors from, 1960 putzing down the middle of the road. So
right.
That's kind of how it works.
So did you do all this on your own, or did you have a fixer or a guide for some of your travels?
No, it was actually entirely on my own. Throughout the entire trip, I only did and signed up for one organized tour, which I also did through an online app, which was basically just to go see the Great Wall of China outside of Beijing. And I happened to get on a English-speaking tour bus with an English-speaking tour guide, and they handled all the purchasing of the tickets and entrance tickets and tram tickets and all that kind of basic logistical stuff. But they also gave you the full history tour and stuff like that was done in English. So outside of that one organized transportation, no, it was all on my own. I basically would use I mean, I had a basic idea of places I wanted to go see. I had some recommendations from my friend. Obviously, outside of Shanghai, I wanted to go see the Yellow Mountains and the Terracotta Warriors and the Forbidden City, and that right there made a huge loop. Basically, all I did was just figured out, get me a train ticket to the city, get me a hotel in the city for a number of days, and then I'd be able to figure out from there where I want to go. And I would usually build in, 1 or 2 days of downtime so that I could just basically relax or wander the streets or go tour some smaller, lesser known locations and stuff like that. But nothing that was organized. Would get a lot of information through looking on places like TripAdvisor or some of these other apps, just reading reviews and getting a handle on it, and then just kind of going for it as a completely independent tourist.
Brave soul.
Yeah, which made it for that much more of an interesting experience. And, within a week or so, I was completely comfortable traveling on my own there. I had, that was the least of the issues that I had was getting around from city to city. So the apps made that very easy to deal with.
Yeah, that's a great recommendation. I guess I wasn't aware of those, but we used an organized tour because we were short on time, so we were only there a week, and so we wanted to maximize the time, and that worked out well, I'd have to say. But
yeah, I think for anyone going on a short window of time, especially if it's in the week or 10 days, and you do want to do that maximized travel, that doing something as an organized tour would probably be far beneficial. As I said, I had the luxury of time so that I could be busy 2 or 3 days in a row and then take a day or two off and just relax. Sometimes just staying in the air conditioned hotel room was vacation enough, given the heat and humidity over there. So
yeah, for sure. Well, we were there a little later. We were there, October, I think, and humidity wasn't so bad. So,
well, that is another excellent point. I can say the overall experience, given, my buddy had warned us that when we get over there, yeah, it'll be hot and it'll be humid. And I've spent a number of weeks down in like the Yucatan and Maya Riviera, and I've been to Hawaii, and so I was like, okay, I've dealt with it before. It probably won't be that bad. Yeah. So I got back, and my first reaction was, thank gosh I won't have to do that again. The first thing I'll take back from my experience is don't go to China in the summertime.
Yeah.
It was really just, the humidity was oppressive. And when you combined it with the smog and then the mix of rain, even the rain couldn't wash the smog out of the air. And it was a really kind of brutal humidity, which is one of the reasons that I did basically have to plan, because after a couple days of playing tourist in that humidity, you'd just be pretty well wiped out. And so either having a travel day where you'd spend, 10 hours on a high-speed train, or just a day off in a hotel, kind of recollecting your body energy was a very worthwhile thing. Where at the most, you could just go out in the afternoon and the evening and spend maybe 4 or 5 hours walking around in that heat just on the city streets. It was pretty nasty. When I got onto the Great Wall of China, it was an absolutely clear, sunny day. It was 96 degrees with about a 60% humidity rating. And you're trying to walk up these huge stone steps of the Chinese wall. And it was really, really tough. So spring and fall are definitely the times to go. If someone asked me, would I go back to China now? I would say, sure, as long as it's not in the summertime.
Yeah, we went to the Great Wall too. We went maybe to a little different spot. Sounded like the one that the tourist trips or tour trips took was pretty touristy, I guess, obviously. So we went to one that was out in the countryside, and that's where we got a taste for what the countryside was like. And
yep.
Yeah, those steps, yeah. It's hard to believe.
Yeah, we might have gone to the same one, because there's one that they say is super popular. I can't remember the name of it, but we began with the letter B. That's where like all the things were, and that's the other thing is, China, these places are crowded with tourists, but you only see, unlike the national parks here, you only see a very small handful of non-Chinese at these places. The Chinese, they just flock to these places. I mean, there's how many, more than 1 billion people in that country. And you can really get a sense of that at these tourist spots, because they are just packed, in places shoulder to shoulder, like you wouldn't believe. So some of these destination areas, they are exceedingly popular with the Chinese populace as destinations. And so I happen to be there, just like any American family. Summertime is when the kids aren't in school. So bammo, that becomes their prime tourist season, despite the heat and the humidity. So when you combine the heat and the humidity with the crowds, then you're really talking a Chinese experience over there. So yeah, definitely, if you want to do it the brave and foolhardy way, that's the way I recommend it. Go in the summer. But if you want a more pleasant experience, definitely stay away from the summertime crowds.
And the other thing you learn very quickly, and our tour guide told us the same thing, is that there's no sense of personal space in China. So everybody just crowds in around you, and you're shoulder to shoulder with whoever else is there.
Yep. Yeah, and I found that especially true at numerous, especially photo locations that were like very, very popular spots, like the very entrance to the Terracotta Warriors or the Emperor's Hall in the Forbidden City. That
right.
The depth of crowd, it was like the nastiest little, kind of like Australian rugby scrum just to get to the front of the line or the front of wherever it was to take a photo.
Right.
And it was just like herding cattle through a little tiny gate, and it was bump and shove, and yeah, there's no sense of personal space, and you're just completely full body contact on every side, and it's just shifting. And it was basically like this mentality of, well, if you want the photo, get in and go for it. And you just like plow your way to the front just like everybody else is doing, and then once you get your shot, you literally have to plow your way back out of the crowd. And doing that a few times was, it was interesting. It was kind of fun in its own right, but that'd be really tough if you had to live with on a day-to-day basis. But yeah, when that many people, one of the other things my friend said was that it was part of the Chinese culture for many years that they wouldn't line up. They say just recently. And I think this is one of the things that they say, China is changing so fast and so rapidly that the China that people visited 10 years ago is not the same China that there is today. And that 10 years ago, it was vastly different than 20 years before that. So they're on this rapid growth of change. And he said one of the things that they're starting to learn how to do is to line up nicely. And I noticed this in the U.S. Embassy, that people would just you'd have this long line of people waiting to their turn, and then there'd be people that would just waltz right up past the entire line and jump right in front and the window. And it's just like you see people trying to get in at the last minute on a traffic exit or something, and all you do is roll your eyes. But he says that they're being much better at that, so that on the subways and stuff, that the lines are no longer quite the free for all. But at some of these photo spots and a few other places, that all seemed to go out the window, and you just literally have to, put your head down and think like a football player. Just barge right on through. So that's the way it had to be done. That's the way it was gonna get done.
The good thing is, I guess, is that places like the Forbidden City are just beautiful beyond belief, and go on forever. The Emperor had it pretty good back in those days, and
yeah, absolutely, yeah. It was an amazing to see and think about, just that length of history, and how until just recently it had been completely closed off, and now it is probably one of the real great tourist sites in the world.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So, what gear did you take? That's always a challenge when you're abroad.
Yeah, and I have to say, I have lived through my carry my gear everywhere phase. And I am now going in the reverse direction. One of the things, and I had done the same thing in my last visit to Cancun, I actually did the reverse. At one point, I had taken all of my Nikon gear on a day hike with me, and my day pack alone was about 40 pounds. And I got done with this 10-mile day pack, and I got back to my truck, and I looked at my buddy I was with, and I said, yeah, this ain't happening again. And at that point, I went out and I bought a little camera to use just for hiking. And so I left all my Nikon gear at home, and I had a single Sony A6300 camera, and for the last year and a half, I basically only had one lens. I had an 18-105 zoom lens. It's on a crop sensor, so its equivalent was about a 26 or 27 millimeter to about a 170 millimeter, and it was a great, fantastic range. and it was super lightweight. I could fit it in the back of a regular book backpack, and I could carry it, out just over my shoulder, and I wouldn't look like I was toting around thousands of dollars worth of camera gear. And It was 5 pounds versus 25 pounds. So all my Nikon gear stayed home. My Gitzo carbon fiber tripod stayed home. I had a small, lightweight aluminum tripod that I had purchased that fit nicely on the side of the backpack, and it was good enough to use, and I could put my backpack on the hook on the bottom to give it a little bit more security. And the only extra thing that I purchased specifically for this trip was a new telephoto lens. So I picked up a 70 to 300 millimeter lens, and that came with me. Unfortunately, because so many of the places I was in was urban areas, the telephoto lens didn't come out that often. And, people talk about this switch to mirrorless to save yourself weight is a complete fallacy if you're using good glass, because the good lenses weigh just as much as the DSLR lenses would. And so this thing was like carrying around an extra 2.5 pound brick everywhere I went, and even that was like substantially more noticeable when I was carrying that around than versus when I wasn't. But yeah, that was the gears. My Sony camera, 2 lenses. I had my basic polarizing filter and a graduated neutral a variable neutral density filter, and that was my entire photographic equipment outside of a lot of memory cards. So, yeah.
I was going to ask you, what'd you do to back up your photos? Just lots of cards?
Well, that was one of the things, and I was about 2 weeks into my trip, and I am just sailing through my memory cards. And I was like, what the heck is going on? So I have a mix of like 32 gigabyte cards and 64 gigabyte cards. And these cards were like filling up unusually fast, and I couldn't figure out what it was. And then I realized somehow I had switched a setting on the camera so that it was taking it's I think what they call DxO range or something like that. It takes basically one photo, but then it turns it into 3 frames with a variation in exposure from that one frame. So it wasn't like a bracket of 3 different frames, but it was like one shot multiplied by 3. And I realized I had filled up these cards with like all these. I had 3 times as many shots as I needed. So in order to regain some of my space, I literally spent, afternoons in a hotel, and even on like a 10-hour train ride, I was having to delete nearly 10,000 photos one at a time, going delete, delete, skip, delete, skip, delete, skip, delete, skip, hours on end trying to reclaim some space, because the one thing I learned over there is that electronic products aren't any cheaper in China than they are here, even though you think that they'd be made in China and are much cheaper. They're not. So a memory card was just as expensive as if you were buying it here. They'd average $30, $40 for a 60 gigabyte card. So it was definitely worthwhile to kind of reclaim that space and maximize the memory cards that I did have. I did wind up having to buy an additional memory card to get through my trip. I wound up buying a 128 gigabyte card. They have Walmarts over there. So I happened to stop into a Walmart and was able to pick up one of these extra cards. So I did have those. That was the primary place my images lived. But I did have something that I had purchased a couple years ago when I went down to the Yucatan, which is a Western Digital wireless 2 terabyte hard drive. And it actually has a slot for an SD card in the hard drive. You don't even need a computer for this hard drive. You operate it with your phone. And you don't even need to do that to back up your cards. You just like turn the thing on, stick the hard drive or stick the SD card into the hard drive, and in 30 seconds later, lights start blinking and it is copying every single image off of your card and putting it into a nice little neat folder that you can then connect wirelessly through your phone or tablet to see all the files. You could actually rename them. The only thing you can't do is actually see the pictures because you don't have any software to do that, but you can see that the files are all there. You can change folder names and stuff like that. And so that would be great. I'd have that one portable little hard drive and then my SD cards. So I therefore automatically had 2 sets of my photos, and those would generally live in different bags, or one would stay at the hotel while all the SD cards would travel with me at all times. And then whenever I was traveling, I made sure I had both of those items in my carry-on case so that I wasn't going to get separated from them.
Yeah, good idea.
Yeah, so, that little Western Digital drive is a pretty cool little thing because it meant that carrying the laptop around was no longer needed. And that alone, between the laptop and the power adapter, that probably saved me close to 8 pounds of travel weight.
Yep, for sure. What subjects did you find most interesting in all your travels there?
Well, that definitely proved to be a little bit more of the challenge for me than I had kind of anticipated, and I kind of knew it walking into this trip. My normal kind of modus operandi would be slanted towards landscape travel photography. So, national parks, landscapes, wilderness, mountains, deserts, coast ranges, stuff like that. And that just wasn't really available to me in China at all, save the Yellow Mountains. And even then, it was the most non-wilderness experience you could imagine from the area I was at. It was crowded with, tour groups all over the place. Again, it was just these immense crowds, and you had tour group after tour group being led by people with loudspeakers. And so it was definitely not any kind of peaceful nature trip, not the sort of environments I was normally used to. So I did kind of have to adapt. I don't consider myself a street photographer, but that was kind of one of the things I wound up having to do. And it was nice to be able to push myself in that direction. I am generally not a people photographer in terms of like portraits. I don't have problems taking people photos, whether it was on assignments or usually it was like some sort of outdoor activity, whether it was hiking or surfing or something like that. that was never a problem. But just actually walking up cold to a person that you see on the street and asking to take their photo was something that I would rarely do. I mean, I would do it on occasion, but this time it became much more of, well, that's what you're going to have to do if you want to get some photos. So I actually started taking a lot more people shots that I would normally do, and that was actually one of the few things I learned to say in Chinese was, may I take your photo, please? And I did. I got, surprisingly a nice number of portrait shots that I was actually really happy with. It was fun because a lot of the younger women and even some of the middle-aged women, it was really funny. When you would ask to take their photo, they would by default go into this complete sort of stylistic pose mode, like a fashion model. You wouldn't even have to ask them. They would do it by default. And that was really funny, but it also made for some great photos. It was also, that was another thing that was really interesting to see, the difference between how we as Westerners and they as Chinese approach photography in some of these locations. And we see it a bit in national parks when we see them come through in their tour groups, that they rush around. The big difference is that they'd all be taking selfies of them in these places. And that's the cultural difference. Whereas we would turn our camera toward the thing itself and take a picture. In China, the cultural norm is for them to take a picture of themselves in connection with the thing. So that's why you'd always see them with their cell phones kind of lined up. And so I went around and I would take lots of pictures of people taking selfies just to document that kind of cultural difference. And it was really fun to watch, because just like, they would do for me when I asked if I could take their photo, they were doing of themselves when they were taking these selfies. They would go right into this kind of like little fashion pose, and you could see them making these little faces in their phones and trying to look cute and quirky. And while they don't have Facebook and Instagram over there, they have their very own, China doesn't censor Facebook and Instagram because they don't want that influence in there. They just want to keep their own apps centralized. And so they've got their own photo sharing spaces and stuff like that they post to, and they've got their own social media. And, they're going at it like gangbusters. Yeah, everywhere you went, it was just person taking selfie after selfie after selfie. So I almost thought I could do like a photo project of that itself. So that turned out to be one of the things. In terms of temples and stuff like that, that was all great. Well, in some of the temples, I found out in one or two cases after the fact that you weren't actually allowed to take photos on the insides of the temples, but you could around the outsides and stuff like that. But after you've been to like 12 or 13 of these temples, they all kind of start to blend in to be the same. So that part was fun. But yeah, then trying to photograph some of the westernization, like, most people were wearing shirts, if they had any text or design on it, were in English, even though these people probably spoke or read zero English. The most popular, the most popular piece of apparel over there is the New York Yankees baseball cap. And so seeing those things would kind of make for a fun subject to photograph. And so that's kind of what I had to push myself out of my nature zone to get into a more city and person centric zone. Someone who is much more naturally fluent in that kind of area in photography would have an absolute field day in China, because that's, especially in the cities and tourist places, that's basically what there was to photograph.
There are actually parks. I went to several of them and specifically requested that from the tour guide, and some were quite nice and very well organized, and some of them were, I don't know what you'd say, they were a little more rough-hewn, I guess.
Yeah.
But there were some pretty subjects, and you kind of got to search for them. And typically, I suppose, like ours, out in the middle of nowhere, so you got to drive for an hour or two to get to them. But
absolutely. And I can't say there were too many areas that I went to, that were outside, kind of like generic places. Like, people here go storm chasing and wind up in the middle of Oklahoma. I didn't get any sort of chance to do that. And, you're not just free to basically rent a car and drive somewhere. So that's a non-option over there. You kind of do with what you can. And, one of the workshops that I teach is on details and more intimate visions. And it's interesting how some people come in and they are so ingrained into these big picture mentality that finding little details and photographing more intimate scenes is actually, really out of their comfort zone. But that's exactly the sort of zone I had to be in with these temples, was like looking for those smaller details and stuff like that. And that made my photography a lot more productive, especially when it came to being inside the temples and stuff like that.
You actually can rent cars in China, but you have to rent a Chinese driver and probably a tour guide. You
can't drive yourself in there. You can't.
Right.
Yeah, they don't
Which
let
is
you do
probably
that.
just as well. From my experience.
Well, that's the other thing my buddy said, is that the national sport in China is chicken. And if you're talking about, trying to navigate some of those city streets, that is exactly right. And he said, sometimes if you're in a taxi or something like that, you just kind of close your eyes and hope you get to your destination safely. And surprisingly, that actually happened to us on a small bus. I was on one of these like 12 passenger buses taking us off to a tourist place from the Yellow Mountains. And this bus driver was passing people on blind curves. I was like, oh God, okay, all right, close my eyes, just hope I make it to the destination. And I swear one time I heard a loud thump, and I literally thought he clipped the mirror off some car at one point. So, yeah, it really happens. And the fact that the other thing that's out there is a huge mode of transportation are electric scooters. And this is what the Chinese government is really pushing people. And so you see thousands and thousands of these individual scooters, and they're driving in all sorts of weather. And, there's no helmet regulations, and, they've got their little kids on the front seat with them and stuff like that. And so that was actually another kind of fun thing to photograph at times. But it was also, like watching a comedy of errors as all of these scooters and all of these cars and all of the buses would try and navigate some of these big city intersections. And it looked scary. And I'm kind of glad that, we've got a little bit more of a, regulated traffic system here. Just, it looked like it would be, a real scary endeavor to be getting around the city in that sort of manner.
Yeah, I had that same experience. So where can people find you and your China photos and all that stuff? I know you haven't gotten the photos up on your website just yet, but you're planning to.
Yeah, so I'm actually, I literally had just finished editing. I think I took in that just shy of 6 weeks, I took about 12,000 photos.
Oh, is that
and
all?
I have edited it finally. It was about 1 a.m. this last Thursday morning, got finished editing through them. And I've basically highlighted about 10%. So I've got about 1,200 images that I have basically done a basic level of process, and I'm going to be weeding those down out. I'm going to put my first set of images up on a blog post this weekend. So just as this podcast will be coming on air, I'll have my first set of teaser images that are basically coming out in a blog post that will be describing how this trip came to be. And that will be in the blog section on my website, which I know you'll have a link to. It's enlightphoto.com. And at that point, from this point on, I'll be releasing subsequent blog posts that highlight individual areas or trips, describing those in a little bit more detail. And then probably within the next month or so, I will be having actual full-on permanent galleries added to my website, and I'll be announcing those not only through blog post as well, so people can subscribe to that, or my newsletter will announce that those galleries have finally been online. So, and you'll have a few of my better images that I'll be sending you to share along with this podcast as well.
Great. Well, Gary, it's been fun as usual. Thanks for being on the show again.
It's my pleasure. I love it. And this was a great opportunity to talk about this trip and specifically, so I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, you're entirely welcome. Show notes, including some of Gary's China photos, are at www.flanaganphotos.com, spelled FLANAGANPHOTOS. Thanks for listening. If you like what you heard, please tell your friends and family. Bye for now, and we'll be back in a couple of weeks.
Thanks for listening to Photographing the West podcast. Please subscribe to the podcast in iTunes and leave us a review. Till next time, here's wishing you safe travels and good light.